There is a photograph of Princess Margaret taken sometime in the early 1950s. She is standing at a piano, cigarette holder raised, head tilted back mid-laugh, and the camera has caught her in a moment so alive, so completely and unapologetically herself, that it almost hurts to look at it knowing what comes next. She was not the queen. Everyone knew that. Her sister Elizabeth wore that destiny from birth, composed, dutiful, already preparing for the weight of a crown before she was old enough to fully understand it. Margaret was the other one, the spare, the second daughter, and yet to almost everyone who ever shared a room with her, Margaret was the one you couldn't stop watching. She was born on the 21st of August, 1930, at Glamis Castle in Scotland, a child who arrived in a place already thick with history, with stone corridors that remembered centuries of Scottish royalty, with the kind of ancestral grandeur that settles into a person's bones whether they ask for it or not. She was the younger daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York, who would become King George VI and Queen Elizabeth just 6 years later, when Margaret was still a small girl trying to understand why her uncle Edward had suddenly vanished from family life and why everything around her had changed overnight. That early disruption, the abdication crisis of 1936, the sudden elevation of her father to a throne he never wanted, shaped Margaret in ways historians have perhaps never fully appreciated. She watched her father, a man she adored, be handed a burden that frightened him. She watched her mother transform practically overnight into a queen, composed, strategic, immovable. And she watched her sister begin the long, serious process of becoming a future monarch. Margaret, at 6 years old, was already learning what it meant to exist in the margins of someone else's destiny. But here is what the margins gave her: freedom. Not the complete freedom of an ordinary girl. Nothing about her life would ever be ordinary, but a freedom from the suffocating weight of direct succession. Elizabeth had to be perfect. Margaret only had to be royal. And within that narrower set of constraints, she found room to be something the British royal family had not produced in quite some time. She was electric. Those who knew her, and accounts from friends, courtiers and contemporaries are remarkably consistent on this point, describe a woman of almost overwhelming personal magnetism. She had her mother's gift for making people feel seen, but without the strategic calculation underneath. Margaret's warmth was genuine, impulsive, sometimes reckless. She laughed loudly. She smoked extravagantly. She quoted Tennyson and Noel Coward with equal ease. She sat at the piano and played jazz when the palace expected something more sedate. She stayed up until 3 in the morning at parties while her sister had long since retired to compose herself for the duties of the following morning. She was also, by every account, extraordinarily beautiful, not in the polished, conventional way that royal portraits tended to freeze women into. She was beautiful in motion, in the gesture, in the expression, in the way a room seemed to reorganize itself around her when she entered. Cecil Beaton, the great photographer who spent decades chronicling the royal family, said she was the most naturally photogenic subject he had ever worked with. And Beaton had worked with everyone. But beauty and brilliance inside a palace are not always gifts. Sometimes they are simply more refined versions of a trap. Because for all her dazzle, Margaret existed inside one of the most rigid institutional structures in the world. The royal family in the 1940s and 1950s was not a place that rewarded spontaneity. It rewarded duty, discretion, and the capacity to subordinate the private self entirely to the public role. Margaret had the public role. What she also had, dangerously, thrillingly, was an enormous private self that refused to be subordinated. She loved art, she loved music, she loved the theatre world, the jazz world, the bohemian fringes of London society where people talked about ideas rather than protocol. She collected brilliant, unconventional friends, artists, writers, actors, people who had earned their place in the world through talent rather than bloodline. And those friends adored her. Not because she was a princess, but because she was Margaret, sharp, funny, loyal, and possessed of a quality rare in any world and almost unheard of inside a palace. She was fully, completely, dangerously herself. That selfhood would be the great gift and the great vulnerability of her life. It was what made her impossible to ignore. It was also what made her impossible to protect. because a woman who burns that brightly attracts not only admirers, she attracts inevitably the kind of person who looks at that light and sees not something to cherish, but something to control. Antony Armstrong-Jones was still years away, but the stage for him was already being built. Before Tony there was Peter, and if you want to truly understand what Antony Armstrong-Jones did to Princess Margaret, not just the facts of it but the depth of it, the particular cruelty of it, you have to understand Peter Townsend first. Because Margaret did not walk into her marriage with Tony as a whole woman. She walked into it as a woman who had already been broken once, already been told that the love she had chosen was the wrong kind of love, already learned that the institution she was born into would always matter more than the desires of the person living inside it. Peter Wordsworth Townsend entered the royal family's orbit as an equerry to King George VI, a decorated RAF group captain, a Battle of Britain veteran, a man who had flown in conditions that would have undone most people, and emerged with the kind of quiet dignity that comes only from having genuinely stared at death and refused to blink. He was handsome in the way that serious men sometimes are, not flashily, not obviously, but in the way that grows on you until one day you realize you cannot stop looking. He was also gentle, thoughtful, the kind of man who listened when you spoke and remembered what you said 3 weeks later. Margaret was 15 when Townsend first joined the household. He was 16 years her senior, and married. For years what existed between them was nothing more than a warm, admiring friendship, the kind that forms naturally when two people of genuine intelligence and feeling spend years in close proximity, inside a world that does not offer many outlets for either. Then two things happened almost simultaneously. Peter's marriage collapsed and ended in divorce, and King George VI, Margaret's beloved father, the man whose quiet courage she had watched up close her entire life, died in February 1952, leaving a 21-year-old Margaret bereft in a way that went beyond ordinary grief. She had lost not just a father but her greatest protector, the man who had in his gentle way always made room for her within the rigid structure of royal life. In that raw, exposed aftermath of loss, what had been a friendship between Margaret and Peter Townsend became something more, and those around her, the friends, the courtiers, the family members, could see it plainly long before any public acknowledgement was made. She was in love, genuinely, completely, for the first time in her life, in love, and Townsend, by all credible accounts, felt exactly the same. The problem, of course, was everything else. He was divorced. The Church of England, of which Margaret's sister, the new Queen Elizabeth II, was now supreme governor, did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons in church. The Royal Marriages Act imposed further complications. The government of the day, under Winston Churchill and then Anthony Eden, made its position quietly but unmistakably clear. A princess of the blood royal could not marry a divorced commoner, not without consequences, not without cost. What followed was one of the most quietly devastating episodes in the modern history of the British royal family. Margaret and Townsend were separated. He was posted to Brussels, officially as an heir attaché, unofficially as a problem being placed at a convenient distance. Margaret was asked to wait, to think, to consider her duty, to remember what the institution required of her. She waited, she thought, she remembered. And then, in October 1955, she released a statement that was dignified, dutiful, and heartbreaking in every syllable. She would not be marrying Group Captain Peter Townsend. She had been mindful, she said, of the Church's teaching on the indissolubility of marriage. She had concluded that she could not be the one to challenge it. The palace got what it wanted, the institution was protected, and Margaret, 24 years old, in love, and told that love was not enough, was left to find a different future. If this story has touched your heart, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel, because every day we bring you those royal stories that history tried to keep hidden. What nobody fully reckoned with in the aftermath of that announcement was the particular kind of damage it left behind. Not the visible damage of public grief, but the quieter, more dangerous damage of a woman who had learned that her deepest feelings could be overruled, who had been told in the most institutional language possible that she was not quite free, who would now approach the next chapter of her life not from a place of wholeness, but from a place of hunger, hungry to be chosen, hungry to be loved on terms that did not come with conditions attached. That hunger was what Tony Armstrong-Jones walked into, and he knew exactly how to feed it. Antony Charles Robert Armstrong-Jones arrived in Margaret's life in 1958, and from the very first moment he was unlike anyone she had ever encountered inside the carefully managed world she inhabited. He was not an aristocrat, he was not military, he was not the kind of man the palace machinery would have produced had it been asked to design a suitable companion for a princess. He was a photographer, and not a society photographer content to flatter his subjects into soft focus compliance. He was genuinely talented, genuinely ambitious, and genuinely interested in a version of London that existed several worlds away from the gilded corridors Margaret had grown up inside. He moved through Soho jazz clubs and East End studios and Chelsea dinner parties with the same easy confidence that most men of his era reserved for only one kind of room. He was comfortable everywhere, which is one of the most seductive qualities a person can possess. He was also, by all accounts, extraordinarily charming. Not charming in the practiced, performative way that courtiers and diplomats learn to be charming, but charming in the way that feels spontaneous, personal, as though the warmth is specifically for you and not for the room. He was witty, quick. He had the photographer's gift of making his subject feel that being seen by him was a privilege, and for a woman like Margaret, brilliant, hungry, still raw from the Townsend rejection, being truly seen felt like oxygen. Their introduction came through mutual friends in the overlapping world of London's artistic and social circles. Margaret had always cultivated friendships outside the palace: writers, actors, musicians, people who engaged with ideas rather than protocol. Tony belonged to that world naturally, effortlessly. He photographed theatre productions. He documented London's working class with a sensitivity that earned him genuine critical respect. He was, in the language of the time, a modern man, and modernity, to Margaret, represented everything the palace had always tried to keep at arm's length. What drew her to him was not just the charm, it was the challenge. Tony did not treat her like a princess. He treated her like a woman, interesting, sometimes difficult, worth arguing with, worth pursuing, but not to be placed reverently on a pedestal and admired from a safe distance. He pushed back, he teased. He had opinions of his own, and was not remotely inclined to surrender them, simply because the person across the table outranked him. For a woman who had spent her entire life surrounded by people who either deferred to her position or used it against her, Tony's refusal to be impressed was intoxicating. But here is what Margaret could not see, what her friends, watching from the outside, began to notice with growing unease almost from the beginning. The same qualities that made Tony so compelling were also the qualities that made him dangerous. His refusal to defer was not always a sign of healthy self-respect. Sometimes it was something harder, a need to dominate, to establish that in any room, in any relationship, he was the one who set the terms. The charm that felt so personal, so specifically directed at Margaret, was not in fact specific to her at all. Tony Armstrong-Jones was charming to everyone, always, as a matter of professional and personal survival. He had grown up without the kind of inherited security that allows people to be straightforwardly themselves. His parents had divorced when he was young. He had constructed himself, his persona, his career, his social world, entirely through force of will and carefully managed impression. He was, in the most fundamental sense, a performer, and performers, as any of Margaret's theatre friends could have told her, are not always playing the same role off stage that they play on it. Her friends saw the inconsistencies early. They noticed the way Tony's attention, so total and focused when he wanted something, became distracted and dismissive once the wanting had been satisfied. They noticed the competitive edge beneath the wit, the slight but unmistakable need to be the most interesting person in any gathering, which meant that Margaret, in his company, was subtly but consistently repositioned from the center to the supporting cast. They noticed. They were worried. They said careful things to her in careful ways. Margaret was not listening. She was, for the first time since Peter Townsend, in love. And love, especially the love that follows a great wound, does not arrive with its eyes open. It arrives desperate. It arrives grateful. It arrives entirely unwilling to see what is standing right in front of it. Antony Charles Robert Armstrong-Jones arrived in Margaret's life in 1958, and from the very first moment he was unlike anyone she had ever encountered inside the carefully managed world she inhabited. He was not aristocracy. He was not military. He was not the kind of man the palace machinery would have produced had it been asked to design a suitable companion for a princess. He was a photographer, and not a society photographer content to flatter his subjects into soft focus compliance. He was genuinely talented, genuinely ambitious, and genuinely interested in a version of London that existed several worlds away from the gilded corridors Margaret had grown up inside. He moved through Soho jazz clubs and East End studios and Chelsea dinner parties with the same easy confidence that most men of his era reserved for only one kind of room. He was comfortable everywhere, which is one of the most seductive qualities a person can possess. He was also, by all accounts, extraordinarily charming, not charming in the practiced performative way that courtiers and diplomats learn to be charming, but charming in the way that feels spontaneous, personal, as though the warmth is specifically for you and not for the room. He was witty, quick. He had the photographer's gift of making his subject feel that being seen by him was a privilege, and for a woman like Margaret, brilliant, hungry, still raw from the Townsend rejection, being truly seen felt like oxygen. Their introduction came through mutual friends in the overlapping world of London's artistic and social circles. Margaret had always cultivated friendships outside the palace: writers, actors, musicians, people who engaged with ideas rather than protocol. Tony belonged to that world naturally, effortlessly. He photographed theatre productions. He documented London's working class with a sensitivity that earned him genuine critical respect. He was, in the language of the time, a modern man, and modernity to Margaret represented everything the palace had always tried to keep at arm's length. What drew her to him was not just the charm, it was the challenge. Tony did not treat her like a princess. He treated her like a woman. Interesting, sometimes difficult, worth arguing with, worth pursuing, but not to be placed reverently on a pedestal and admired from a safe distance. He pushed back, he teased. He had opinions of his own and was not remotely inclined to surrender them simply because the person across the table outranked him. For a woman who had spent her entire life surrounded by people who either deferred to her position or used it against her, Tony's refusal to be impressed was intoxicating. But here is what Margaret could not see, what her friends watching from the outside began to notice with growing unease almost from the beginning. The same qualities that made Tony so compelling were also the qualities that made him dangerous. His refusal to defer was not always a sign of healthy self-respect. Sometimes it was something harder, a need to dominate, to establish that in any room, in any relationship, he was the one who set the terms. The charm that felt so personal, so specifically directed at Margaret, was not in fact specific to her at all. Antony Armstrong-Jones was charming to everyone, always, as a matter of professional and personal survival. He had grown up without the kind of inherited security that allows people to be straightforwardly themselves. His parents had divorced when he was young. He had constructed himself, his persona, his career, his social world, entirely through force of will and carefully managed impression. He was, in the most fundamental sense, a performer, and performers, as any of Margaret's theatre friends could have told her, are not always playing the same role off stage that they play on it. Her friends saw the inconsistencies early. They noticed the way Tony's attention, so total and focused when he wanted something, became distracted and dismissive once the wanting had been satisfied. They noticed the competitive edge beneath the wit, the slight but unmistakable need to be the most interesting person in any gathering, which meant that Margaret in his company was subtly but consistently repositioned from the center to the supporting cast. They noticed. They were worried. They said careful things to her in careful ways. Margaret was not listening. She was, for the first time since Peter Townsend, in love, and love, especially the love that follows a great wound, does not arrive with its eyes open. It arrives desperate. It arrives grateful. It arrives entirely unwilling to see what is standing right in front of it. There is a particular kind of cruelty that never leaves a mark you can show anyone. It does not arrive as a shout or a slap or an accusation made in front of witnesses. It arrives quietly. It arrives in private. It arrives in the spaces between public moments, in the silences after dinner parties, in the small daily transactions of a shared life that nobody outside the marriage ever fully sees. It is the cruelty of the carefully chosen word, the perfectly timed dismissal, the humiliation engineered to be invisible to everyone except the person it is designed to wound. This was Antony Armstrong-Jones's particular gift, and he deployed it against Princess Margaret with a consistency and a creativity that, once her friends began to fully understand the scale of it, left them struggling to find language adequate to describe what they were witnessing. The notes came first, or rather, the notes were what became known first, because they were concrete, documentable, the kind of evidence that survives in ways that whispered cruelties do not. Tony had a habit of writing notes to Margaret and hiding them in places she would find them unexpectedly, tucked into her clothing, slipped between the pages of books she was reading, left in drawers she would open in the ordinary course of a day. The concept on the surface might sound almost romantic, notes left for a spouse to discover, small private communications in a life conducted largely in public. But these were not love notes, they were precise, targeted cruelties, short sentences crafted to locate Margaret's deepest insecurities and press on them with surgical accuracy. Comments about her appearance, her intelligence, her value as a person, reminders in writing of the ways in which she fell short. They were written with the care of someone who understood that the written word lands differently than the spoken one, that it can be read and reread, that it sits in the mind long after the moment has passed, that it has a permanence the spoken insult does not. Tony was a man who worked with images for a living. He understood, perhaps better than most, how to make something last. The effect on Margaret was exactly what anyone paying attention might have predicted. She began to doubt herself. Not all at once. The process was too gradual for that, too carefully managed to be recognized as a process at all. But slowly, across months and then years, the woman who had entered the marriage trailing brilliance and confidence and that extraordinary electric quality that had made her the most captivating presence in any room she entered, that woman began to dim. The laughter became less frequent. The wit became more guarded. The spontaneity that had always been her most defining characteristic began to be replaced by something more careful, more watchful, more anxious. The public humiliations ran alongside the private ones. Tony had a talent for the social slight, the kind that is executed so smoothly that witnesses are never quite certain whether they saw what they think they saw. A dismissive glance at precisely the wrong moment, a correction delivered in company with just enough edge to sting but not enough volume to cause a scene, a comment that could be passed off as a joke if challenged but that everyone in the room understood was not quite a joke at all. He would contradict her in front of guests, not aggressively but with the patient, slightly weary tone of a man correcting someone who consistently gets things wrong. He would redirect conversations away from her observations toward his own. He would, in the most socially invisible ways possible, consistently position himself as the more interesting, more credible, more significant presence in any gathering. And because he was charming, because Antony Armstrong-Jones was in social settings almost impossibly charming, people laughed and moved on and did not always register the pattern, but Margaret's friends registered it. They sat at those dinner tables, they watched those exchanges, and they began to collect the moments the way people collect evidence when they suspect something is wrong but cannot yet name it precisely. What made it more difficult, what made it genuinely complex rather than simply awful, was that the marriage was not without tenderness in its early years. Tony could be warm, he could be attentive, he was genuinely interested in art and beauty and ideas, and on the level of intellectual companionship he and Margaret were genuinely well matched. There were good periods, there were moments that looked from the outside and perhaps even from the inside like the marriage it had promised to be. But the cruelties were consistent in a way the warmth was not. The warmth came and went, the notes, the slights, the quiet daily erosion of her confidence, these were constants, and constants over time are what shape a person. Not the exceptional moments, not the highs or the dramatic lows, but the steady, unremarkable, day after day accumulation of small experiences that eventually become the atmosphere a person breathes. Margaret was breathing diminishment. Every day, in ways large and small, visible and invisible, she was being told by the person who was supposed to love her most that she was less than she believed herself to be, less than she was, less than she deserved. Her friends watched it happen and felt the particular helplessness of people who can see a disaster assembling itself piece by piece but cannot make the person at the center of it see what they see, because Margaret for years could not see it. Or perhaps, and this is the more heartbreaking possibility, she could see it, and had simply decided that this diminished love was still more than she had any right to expect. A woman who had already been told once that her love was not enough learns over time to lower her expectations of what enough means. Tony understood that. Whether consciously or not, he built his cruelty on exactly that foundation, and the foundation held for far longer than it should have. There is a detail about Antony Armstrong-Jones that tends to stop people cold when they first encounter it. He was conducting an affair at the time of his wedding, not before the relationship with Margaret became serious. Not in some murky period of emotional overlap that could be explained away as the messy, complicated business of two lives converging. At the time of the wedding itself, when the Abbey was full and the cameras were rolling and 30 million people were watching what they believed was a love story beginning, Antony Armstrong-Jones was already betraying the woman he was marrying. Her name was Camilla Fry. She was the wife of one of Tony's close friends, Jeremy Fry, who had originally been announced as Tony's best man before quietly stepping aside citing health reasons. The relationship between Tony and Camilla had been ongoing, intimate, and in the way that Tony conducted all his private life, carefully compartmentalized from everything else. There would later be questions, never definitively resolved, about whether a child Camilla bore around this time was Tony's. The question itself tells you something about the nature and the timeline of the involvement. What it tells you more broadly, what it tells you about the man Margaret had married, is this. Antony Armstrong-Jones did not experience fidelity as a value, he experienced it as a constraint, and constraints in his emotional vocabulary were things that applied to other people. He had grown up constructing himself entirely on his own terms, moving through social worlds and personal relationships with the fluid ease of someone who had decided very early that the rules governing ordinary people's behavior were, for him, largely optional. This was not an isolated lapse. This was a pattern, one that had existed before the marriage and would continue, with remarkable consistency and very little apparent guilt, throughout it. Over the years that followed the wedding, Tony maintained a series of relationships with other women, conducted with the same careful compartmentalization that characterized everything else about his private life. Some were brief, some were sustained over significant periods. None of them appear to have troubled him greatly in terms of the betrayal they represented. What is particularly striking when you examine the record is not just the infidelity itself but the attitude that surrounded it. Tony did not hide his extramarital life out of shame or remorse. He hid it out of practicality, because exposure would have been inconvenient, not because he believed he was doing anything that required genuine concealment on moral grounds. There is a difference between a person who is unfaithful and knows it is wrong, and a person who is unfaithful and has simply never fully accepted that their partner's feelings constitute a meaningful claim on their behavior. Tony belonged to the second category. Margaret, for much of the marriage, did not know the full extent of it, or rather, and this is the distinction that matters, she knew enough to be deeply unhappy without knowing enough to act decisively. There were suspicions, there were confrontations, there were the particular silences that settle into a marriage when both parties understand that something has gone wrong, but one of them controls the language of what has gone wrong, and the other is left without the words to name it clearly. Her friends knew more than she did in many cases. Information reached them through the overlapping social networks of London's artistic and aristocratic worlds, worlds small enough that secrets travelled, even when they travelled slowly. And what they heard, pieced together across years of quietly exchanged intelligence, was a picture of a man conducting a parallel life with considerable energy and minimal conscience. The knowledge was agonizing precisely because of its incompleteness. They could not go to Margaret with rumors. They could not place in front of her a clean, documented account of every betrayal and ask her to act on it. What they had were fragments, credible, disturbing fragments, but fragments nonetheless. And Margaret, already diminished by years of private cruelty, was not in a condition to receive fragments and construct from them the full picture they implied. She needed someone to tell her clearly, completely, that what was being done to her was not love, that what she was enduring was not the ordinary difficulty of a complex marriage, but something more systematic, more deliberate, and more damaging than any person, princess or otherwise, should be asked to absorb. Her friends tried, in the ways available to them, in careful conversations, in gentle questions, in the quiet, persistent presence of people who refused to pretend everything was fine. They tried. But trying, when the person you love has decided that this is simply what her life is now, is a particular and exhausting kind of grief. They grieved for her, and they watched, and they waited for her to finally see what they had seen for years. There is a specific kind of pain that belongs exclusively to the people who love someone in a bad marriage. It is not the pain of the person inside it. That pain is its own category, its own universe of experience, and nobody outside it can fully map its contours. The pain of the witness is different. It is the pain of clarity without power, of seeing with complete and terrible precision exactly what is happening to someone you love, and understanding with equal precision that your seeing it changes almost nothing, that the person at the center of it has access to the same information you do, and is, for reasons that are entirely human and entirely heartbreaking, choosing not to assemble it into the conclusion it demands. Margaret's friends lived inside that pain for years. They were not a small or an insignificant group. The inner circle that surrounded Margaret throughout her marriage included some of the most perceptive, worldly, and emotionally intelligent people in mid-20th century Britain. These were not naive observers. These were men and women who had navigated the complexities of public life, of artistic worlds, of aristocratic social structures where the gap between surface and reality was always vast, and the ability to read beneath the surface was a basic survival skill. They were not easily fooled. They were not given to melodrama. When they looked at Margaret's marriage and felt afraid, their fear was not the product of imagination. It was the product of evidence. If this story has touched your heart, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel, because every day we bring you those royal stories that history tried to keep hidden. They saw it in her face first, or rather, in the gradual, almost imperceptible changes to her face across the early years of the marriage. The quality that had always made Margaret so extraordinary to be around was her expressiveness. She could not conceal what she felt. Her delight was total. Her amusement was infectious, her boredom was transparent, her warmth was immediate and unconditional. She was, in the language of photographers, endlessly readable. But somewhere in the middle years of the marriage, something in that expressiveness began to close down. Not completely. Margaret was never capable of complete concealment. It was not in her nature, but enough to be noticed by the people who had known her longest. The laughter came a beat later than it used to. The eyes, which had always been her most expressive feature, developed a guardedness that had not been there before. She began to watch rooms rather than inhabit them. They saw it in the way she spoke about Tony and company, not in what she said. Margaret was far too socially skilled to say anything directly incriminating in mixed company, but in what she didn't say, in the pauses, in the way certain subjects were navigated around rather than through, in the particular brightness that appeared in her manner when Tony's name came up in conversation, the brightness that people who have spent time in difficult relationships will recognize immediately as the brightness of performance, of a person working harder than they should have to at appearing fine. They saw it in the dynamic between the two of them at social gatherings. Tony, charming and expansive, holding court, directing the energy of the room. Margaret, brilliant Margaret, who had never in her life required anyone else to hold a room for her, occupying a position just slightly to the side of center, laughing at his jokes with just a fraction more enthusiasm than the jokes always warranted, deferring to his opinions in a way that sat wrongly on a woman whose own opinions had always been among her most defining characteristics. Some of her friends attempted to speak to her directly. These conversations, by the accounts of those who had them, were among the most difficult of their lives. Margaret was not a woman who received concern about her marriage easily. She had been raised inside a family and an institution that treated the interior of a marriage as inviolable private territory, not to be examined, not to be questioned, and certainly not to be discussed with people outside it, however beloved those people might be. She had also inherited, from the same family and the same institution, a fierce and complicated pride. To acknowledge that her marriage was in trouble was to acknowledge that the choice she had made after Peter Townsend, after all that loss and sacrifice and public heartbreak, had been the wrong one. That was a recognition almost too painful to approach. So when friends tried, and they tried, carefully, gently, in the ways that people try when they know they are navigating around someone's deepest wound. Margaret deflected. She changed the subject. She made a joke. She deployed that extraordinary social brilliance of hers as a shield, turning the conversation somewhere safer before it could land anywhere that required her to respond honestly. But she heard them. Her friends believed, then and afterward, that she heard every word, that beneath the deflection and the jokes and the practiced brightness, some part of Margaret was receiving what they were saying and filing it somewhere she could not yet afford to look. That somewhere grew crowded over the years, and the weight of everything stored inside it grew heavier with each passing season, heavier and more impossible to carry, and more inevitable in what it was eventually going to do to the woman carrying it. Her friends could see the weight. They could see it in her posture, in her drinking, in the way she held herself at the end of an evening when the performance was almost done and the exhaustion underneath it briefly showed through. They saw all of it. They saw her clearly, completely, in the way that only people who truly love someone can see them, and they could not save her. That is the part that stayed with them longest. Not the anger at Tony, though the anger was real and it was fierce. Not the frustration at the institution that had already broken her once before, but the simple, devastating, unanswerable fact that they had seen what was happening, and they had tried, and it had not been enough. Love, it turns out, is not always sufficient protection. Sometimes the people who love you most can do nothing but watch, and witness, and remain, so that when the person at the center finally decides she is ready to see what they have always seen, she does not have to see it alone. Damage, when it is sustained and systematic, does not announce itself dramatically. It does not arrive as a single catastrophic event that everyone can point to and name and understand. It arrives the way water damages stone, slowly, incrementally, through the patient repetition of small impacts that individually seem survivable but collectively, over time, reshape the thing they are acting upon into something unrecognizable from what it once was. By the mid-1960s, the reshaping of Princess Margaret was well underway. It showed first in the habits. The cigarettes had always been part of her public image. The long ivory holder, the elegant gesture, the slight air of defiance that came with smoking in an era when a princess was expected to present herself as something closer to a porcelain figure than a human being with appetites and vices. But the smoking deepened, became heavier, became less a stylistic choice and more a functional one, the kind of smoking that people do not do for pleasure but for management, for the brief, reliable relief of a nervous system that has been running too hot for too long. The drinking followed a similar trajectory. Margaret had always enjoyed a drink. She was her mother's daughter in that respect, and the Queen Mother's fondness for a gin and then a whiskey was something the royal family treated as an endearing eccentricity rather than a concern. But what had been social drinking, pleasurable drinking, the drinking of a woman who enjoyed good company and the loosening of formality that a well-made cocktail could provide, that gradually became something else, something with more urgency to it, something that her friends, watching carefully, recognized as the drinking of a person who is managing pain rather than celebrating life. The late nights extended. Margaret had always been a night person. The palace's social schedule had never suited her natural rhythms, and she had spent most of her adult life gravitating toward the hours when protocol relaxed and people became more genuinely themselves. But now the late nights took on a different quality, less celebratory, more escapist. The parties she attended and sometimes hosted at Kensington Palace, where she and Tony had established their household, became occasions where the gaiety felt increasingly performed, bright and brittle on the surface, with something hollower underneath. Her physical health began to reflect what her emotional health had been experiencing for years. She developed recurring respiratory problems, hardly surprising given the volume of cigarettes, but worsened, her doctors privately noted, by the kind of chronic stress that lives in the body as surely as it lives in the mind. She lost weight in ways that did not look like the weight loss of a woman flourishing. She developed the particular fragility of someone who is spending more energy maintaining appearances than they have left over for anything else. And through all of it, Tony continued to flourish. This is perhaps the detail that Margaret's friends found most difficult to witness, not the cruelty itself, which was at least consistent and therefore in some grim way predictable, but the disparity. While Margaret contracted, Tony expanded. His career reached new heights. His social world broadened. He moved through London with the energy of a man for whom life was working out extremely well, collecting commissions and connections and admirers with the same easy confidence he had always possessed. The contrast was not lost on those watching. A man was thriving, a woman was diminishing. And the line connecting those two facts, the line that ran directly through the marriage, through the notes and the affairs and the daily quiet erosions, was visible to everyone except, it seemed, to the people whose institutions and interests depended on not seeing it. The royal family managed Margaret's decline the way it managed most uncomfortable realities, with distance, with discretion, and with the faint institutional hope that things would somehow resolve themselves without requiring anyone to intervene directly. The palace was not equipped for the conversation that needed to happen. It never had been. Her friends remained. They showed up. They sat with her through the late evenings when the performance finally dropped and the exhaustion showed through. They did not look away from what they saw in those unguarded moments, the sadness that had settled into her like weather, permanent and pervasive, the kind of sadness that stops being acute and becomes simply the condition of a life. The light that had once made Margaret impossible to look away from was not gone, but it was diminished, banked down to something smaller, something more careful, something that flared occasionally, in a perfect witty remark, in a moment of genuine warmth with someone she trusted, and then retreated again behind the careful management of a woman who had learned, at considerable cost, that burning too brightly attracted the wrong kind of attention. Tony had taught her that. Whatever else he had taken from her, he had taken that. The freedom to be fully, dangerously, gloriously herself without consequence. And that of everything was perhaps the loss her friends mourned most. By the mid-1970s, the marriage between Princess Margaret and Antony Armstrong-Jones had ceased to function in any meaningful sense of the word. What remained was an arrangement, two people occupying the same institutional space, maintaining the outward forms of a union that had long since lost whatever interior life it had once possessed. They moved through public engagements separately. They spent increasing amounts of time apart. Tony had his world, his career, his studio, his parallel life conducted with the practiced ease of a man who had always kept his existences in separate sealed compartments. Margaret had mystique, the Caribbean island where she had been gifted a plot of land by a friend, and where she had built a villa that represented in its remoteness and its beauty and its distance from everything the palace required of her, the closest thing to genuine freedom her life had ever contained. But freedom at the edges of a life is not the same as freedom at the center of it, and Margaret, for all the relief that mystique provided, was not a woman who had ever wanted to live at the edges. She had been born for the center. She had been made for it. The brilliance, the magnetism, the extraordinary quality of presence that had defined her from childhood. Exile, however beautiful, was still exile. The formal separation was announced in March 1976. The statement was brief, dignified, and carefully worded in the way that palace statements always are, designed to convey the minimum of information while giving the impression of transparency. It confirmed that the Princess and Lord Snowdon, as Tony had become following his elevation to the earldom of Snowdon in 1961, had agreed to live apart. It asked for privacy. It offered nothing further. The press, naturally, offered a great deal further. What followed was the kind of media coverage that the British tabloid press of the 1970s specialized in, intrusive, voracious, and only intermittently concerned with accuracy. Margaret's private life was excavated and displayed with cheerful thoroughness. Her friendship with a younger man, Roddy Llewellyn, which had provided her with genuine warmth and companionship during the bleakest years of the marriage, was treated as scandal rather than what it actually was, the entirely human response of a lonely woman to the offer of uncomplicated affection. Tony, meanwhile, conducted his post-separation public life with characteristic smoothness. He gave interviews. He continued working. He remarried in 1978, the same year the divorce was finalized, with a speed that suggested the parallel life he had been maintaining throughout the marriage had simply formalized itself into the next chapter. He appeared in every public forum as a man who had moved on efficiently and without particular regret. The divorce was finalized in July 1978. It was the first divorce in the British royal family in decades, a fact the press noted with the particular relish reserved for institutional firsts, especially when those firsts involve failure. For Margaret, it represented something beyond scandal. It represented the collapse of the structure she had built her post-Townsend life upon, the choice she had made, the love she had committed to, the years she had spent diminishing herself in service of a marriage that was never what it had promised to be. All of it had produced this: a legal document, a tabloid headline, a defeat so public that there was nowhere to take it privately. Her friends gathered around her in the aftermath. They did what they had always done. They showed up, they stayed, they refused to look away. They did not say what some of them were thinking, which was that they had seen this coming for almost 20 years. That the defeat, as complete and as painful as it was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. What they said instead was simpler and more important. They said they were there. They said they loved her. They said that what had been done to her was not her fault and was not her failure, however loudly the world's framing of the story suggested otherwise. Whether Margaret fully believed them is a question that cannot be answered with certainty, but she heard them. And for a woman who had spent the better part of 2 decades being told, in ways subtle and not so subtle, that she was less than she was, being heard, truly heard, by people who saw her clearly and loved what they saw, was not nothing. It was in fact everything. Princess Margaret spent her final years on the margins of a world she had once illuminated. The strokes began in 1998, small ones at first, manageable, the kind that doctors describe in careful clinical language designed to contain the alarm they actually represent, but they accumulated. Each one took something, a little of the vision, a little of the mobility, a little of the extraordinary physical presence that had always been so central to who she was. By the end she had lost the sight in one eye almost entirely. She moved with difficulty. The woman who had once been the most glamorous royal in the world spent her final months in a wheelchair, largely withdrawn from public life, her famous vitality reduced to occasional flickers that those around her recognized, with a grief they did not always know how to express, as the last evidence of the person she had been. She died on the 9th of February 2002 at the King Edward VII Hospital in London. She was 71 years old. The official cause was a stroke. The real cause, those who loved her might have argued, was longer and more complicated and had begun accumulating long before any blood vessel failed. Her mother died 7 weeks later. The two women, the Queen Mother at 101, Margaret at 71, were buried within weeks of each other, and the double loss had the quality of an ending, of a particular chapter of royal history closing with a finality that felt appropriate even as it felt devastating. They had been, in their complicated and sometimes painful way, deeply bound to each other. The institution that had shaped them both had also in different ways broken them both, and now they were gone within the same season, as though the story had decided it was finished. Antony Armstrong-Jones outlived Margaret by 13 years. He died in 2017, aged 86, having spent the decades after their divorce continuing to work, continuing to be celebrated as one of the great photographers of his generation, continuing to exist in the world with the untroubled ease of a man whose public legacy had been largely insulated from the private record of what he had done inside a marriage. History has not been entirely kind to that insulation. The accounts that have emerged in the years since Margaret's death, from friends, from biographers granted access to private correspondence, from the patient accumulation of testimony from people who were there and saw what they saw, have assembled a picture of Antony Armstrong-Jones that the charming public persona never quite suggested. A picture of a man who understood how to make a brilliant woman feel small, and who exercised that understanding with a consistency that amounted to something more deliberate than cruelty. Something closer to a choice, made daily, over years. Margaret deserved better. Her friends knew it from the beginning. They said it in the ways available to them, in the careful conversations and the persistent presence and the refusal to pretend that what they were witnessing was anything other than what it was. She was a woman who burned with a light that very few people in any generation possess. A woman of brilliance and warmth and an appetite for life that the palace had spent decades trying to contain and a husband had spent years trying to extinguish. The light was not extinguished, not entirely. It was diminished, yes, it was banked down and made smaller and forced into corners it should never have been asked to occupy, but it was never fully gone. It showed in the wit that never left her even at the end, in the loyalty she inspired in the people who loved her, in the way rooms still reorganized themselves around her, even when she had lost so much of everything else. What Tony took from her was real, and it was significant, and it should be named as such. But what he could not take, what no amount of hidden notes or quiet cruelties or breathtaking infidelities could finally extinguish, was the essential Margaret, the woman her friends had always seen, the woman who had burned so brightly, for so long, against so many forces determined to reduce her. She deserved a love that matched that light. She never got it, and that in the end is the story her friends had always been trying to tell. If this story has touched your heart, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel, because every day we bring you those royal stories that history tried to keep hidden.